Up to this point in our series, we have been considering musical architecture in terms of blocks of time passing articulated with inner divisions. This was the principal feature of the musical architecture of Viennese classicism in the latter half of the 18th and the early decades of the 19th century, as picked up by the Romantics. That is, the musical structures of the second half of the Age of Enlightenment or Age of Reason. Musicologists have tended to divide that cultural era of Western civilization called the Age of Reason into two halves. And in this program, we'd like to chat with you about the principal forms and processes of the first half of the Age of Reason: logic, rationale, applied not to blocks of time articulated by silence, but rather to continuous line, the art of combining lines, counterpoint, and their chief form, the fugue. In order to appreciate the essence of linear dialogue, that is, fugue, we'd like to begin with a consideration of the simplest of the contrapuntal forms, the invention. And I'd like us to consider first the two-part inventions of Bach, as demonstrated in the C major invention. You'll hear right away the difference between this music and the music that you have been hearing in the first three programs. Once we begin, there is no cessation of sound. The music spins along. Also, you tend to hear not a melody, an accompaniment, but rather two equal partners at work here in the process. Two equal partners who seem to have an equal amount of breath necessary to move us through this continuous skein of musical material. For example, listen to this. A C major invention of Bach. Now, how is that put together? Well, we mentioned the chief difference between this and the music that you have been hearing. You heard the continuity. Well, you also hear that the equality of these two voices, as we see it on the printed page and as you hear it, this equality is guaranteed by the fact that both of the voices concerned, both of the lines, in this case being a keyboard work, right hand, left hand, are being worked with the same material. They share a common theme, a common idea. That idea is very clearly recognizable. It has a specific rhythmic shape which never alters. In this case, ta-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-dee-da-dum. And most of the time it has a specific pitch series, or what you might say, melodic motif, which then clearly identifies it as the work proceeds. The repetition of this material, in which the main motif is attached onto itself and proceeds in one long spinning line, is referred to as sequential material. You recognize as it is spun out. At first, the dialogue is led by the right hand or upper voice. Then we come to a full close, and the left hand takes over. Thus, once more, declaring the equality of these lines. Here we do not have, then, subservience of harmony, melody. There's no hierarchy here. We have two equals. You hear this equality sometimes in close dialogue, and that dialogue continued in a dialogue sequence or chain. Sometimes it sounds even closer in its answering, almost as if, and my son put it this way one day, it sounded to him like two soccer players both chasing the same ball. You think about that as I play it for you again. Counterpoint, then, the art of line in motion. This idea of linear motion, of progress through musical time, of co-equal lines, depends upon the ability of the composer to spin that line. The other analogy I like to use is as if you had a single idea, like a ball of yarn, and you took that ball and threw it out across the floor. It unwinds and it winds. It's process. You don't know quite when it's going to run out unless you know the size of that original ball, and that size is determined by our composer. The material is always the same color, the same thickness, but our interest is in the progress of that ball through time. You think about that as well as the idea of the dialoguing as we listen to Lynn Stodola, who is going to play for us another two-part invention by Bach, in this time in B-flat major. it might be simplistic to say that a fugue is simply an overgrown invention, but perhaps we can at least demonstrate that the principles at work, which you heard in this very simple piece a moment ago, are extended to make one of the greatest achievements of the musical age of reason, the fugue. Unlike sonata form, which we were able to demonstrate in terms of blocks of set size and interior character, the fugue is an open, a living thing, a process. It has certain principles without which it could not be an imitative contrapuntal work. But its length, its inner action is much freer than the sonata form model of the succeeding half of the Age of Reason. You heard in the inventions a single idea or subject carried on in dialogue between, in that case, two voices. What we've tried to do here is to show you the principles of fugue, the line in motion, some of the component elements of that. Then I'll illustrate it at the piano and we'll hear a complete fugue. The fugue must have a subject. In this case, we have a four-voice fugue. Each of the voices, in turn, in an order determined by the composer for that particular composition, enters with that subject. When all the voices have entered, we say that the exposition of the fugue may be complete. And here we've tried to show you that. The subject, and to make it easy, we've just done it in successive voices: soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Quite often, when the subject appears in the second voice, it is accompanied in the continuing line of the first voice by material called a counter subject, material which always comes in counterpoint to that subject in its subsequent entries. And so we can make up an imaginary fugue here in which subject, 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 each of the four entries, has as accompaniment a counter subject here, here, and here. After the statement of that counter subject or counter material, the voice must continue with free material, or else material that is derived from the initial material, but not necessarily a strict subject. And so a complete exposition could look like this graphically, with your prescribed material and your freer line. The rest of the work, well, that's up to the composer to realize his process as he sees fit with the subject that he has created. We have the main body of the fugue, or middle fugue, in which we have a succession of free contrapuntal lines alternating with entrances of the original subject. Hence, you can have your free material here, and then the subject enters. The voice continues with more line, another line picks up, and the subject enters in this case, the alto voice, and so on. The normal procedure is that the fugue ends with a restatement of the idea through the voices, as we have shown you here at the end. And in this case, we've decided that the soprano voice will climax the fugue with one glorious statement of the subject at the end. Well, we have here then lines in flowing motion, sharing in an event, a tapestry of interwoven sound. Let me show you from two fugues how this works. First of all, a typical exposition in which you hear the idea stated in the alto, picked up by the soprano, tenor, bass. Each voice has entered in turn, and we have realized yet another possibility of these 4 entering voices. In the fugue which you're about to hear complete, the subject is very clearly articulated. And here we have demonstrated one of the very, very special techniques of Bach. And that was his ability, which he derived from the orchestral fugues of Vivaldi, to give such a clear rhythmic presentation in his fugue that there was no escaping that sound, that identity, even in the most complex of interweaving linear tapestry as the work progressed. So whether you have the subject as a whole or whether just its head in dialogue with itself. The identity is always with us. So clarity of subject identity, the ability to enjoy the experience of hearing the voice re-enter after a few measures of silence perhaps in a particular voice, even as the music moves on, our ball of yarn unwinding, this time with several skeins. That is part of the joy, the excitement of a typical Bach fugue. Johann Sebastian Bach, one of the master intellects of music of all time, who in his organ and chorale fugues, his inventions, his sinfonias, the 48 preludes and fugues, the collection dating from the end of his life called simply The Art of Fugue, demonstrated his mastery of this form of interweaving lines. Interestingly enough, Bach's major performing instrument, the organ, has an offering for us as a visual corollary to the art of counterpoint. Here we have one of the more elaborate organ cases of the Baroque. And here you see realized before your eyes the same sort of linear movement and inner articulations that we have been talking about. The parallel lines, each of equal importance that we find, parallel within each component of the design, hence in counterpoint with each other, but also multiplying these counterpoints as the eye dances from one set to the other. The inner breathing, which you may recall from our diagram, in which that space is necessary in order that you can hear the entrance again, is also afforded by these organ cases, whereas you see here the pipes extend to this point, then we have the break, then they begin again. Play, lightness, line, musical rhythms to the eye, musical rhythms to the ear. A perfect corollary of artistic practice, visual and oral, of the Baroque. Let's hear a complete fugue then, as played by Lynn Stodola. It is the fugue of which I played you the subject a few minutes before, Bach's C minor fugue. we can say that fugue has a model, and yet those of us who study music in conservatories or universities have to accept that there is no such thing as an academic fugue. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this program, it is up to the composer to decide what his subject will allow him to do. One of the most exciting facets of Bach's mastery of the idiom was the variety of fugue subjects which the master was able to invent. We have subjects in a so-called antique style, in which he transfers to the keyboard the idioms of late Renaissance vocal polyphony. We have fugue subjects in the current French Baroque style, translating to the keyboard the orchestral idioms of the French orchestral types. We also have the Italian orchestral types transferred to the keyboard, the musical idioms of Vivaldi. All of these, plus the keyboard idioms which you have heard, are cast in a form which is a process. The elements of that form of linear play must be realized. A linear play which includes the exposition, the middle entries. Sometimes those entries overlap each other, the so-called stretto entry, in which a second voice enters before the first one is complete. These are all possibilities in the contrapuntal game. Other possibilities is our subject may be turned upside down. We hear it with the intervals reversed. The tune may be sent backwards. But all these possibilities within the game must be realized in terms of a process. Form as process, a living, breathing set of lines in continuous motion, in continuous tapestry, moving through space. One of the greatest achievements of man the music maker, and certainly one of the greatest artistic achievements in the Age of Reason in any of the arts. An appreciation of this can be gained as much by contrast, which is why we set this up as a contrast to the articulated forms and silences of the later Age of Reason sonata form. The last fugue that we are going to hear, played by Lynn Stodola, is an example of yet another type of subject, the jig fugue. There are several of these for organ, and Bach's organ predecessors, such as Buxtehude, have given us several delightful examples of these musical dances, as it were, almost time off for a holiday in the more cerebral intellectual processes of fugue action. What happens with the jig fugue is a hint of what will come when the Romantic composers take over the contrapuntal process. After the initial entries, we tend to lose the identity of the individual players in the game, sit back, and, through our ears, enjoy the game for its own sake. Enjoy the total process. I'd like you to do that as we listen to this jig fugue from the Toccata in D major by Bach. You will hear the dancing subject, you will hear it picked up by the other voices, but soon the pianist and the composer and ourselves become totally involved in the game of line that is a Bach fugue.
you.